So we're on to talking about Chapter 1 of Kill All Normies, and this chapter is titled The Leaderless Digital Counter-Revolution, which is a good title, and something I find fascinating as a kind of techno-utopian and an ideological anarchist. This change, this difference, this thing that's happened in society is something I find fascinating. And she goes back to things like the Arab Spring and to Occupy to talk about these, and to kind of say that this digital utopianism was blunted by, I guess you'd call them failures that these things were. But I think there's reasons for the failings of Occupy and the failings of the Arab Spring that aren't necessarily present for other leaderless, digitally focused revolutions that have succeeded. I would say Gamergate worked. I would say Black Lives Matter has, to a lesser extent, worked. And I think by examining these failures and these successes, we can come to some kind of understanding as to why. I mean, when we look at Occupy, the problem wasn't necessarily that it was leaderless, but that there were, if anything, too many people trying to be leaders, too many people with too many different causes. And Occupy as a whole demanded absolute adherence to an increasingly vague and disassociative amount of orthodoxies. So where it started with a singular purpose that a huge variety of people could conglomerate around and campaign effectively and form alliances on, it gradually crept to encompass all of these other things, and that inevitably meant division and lack of focus, and that's why it failed. When we look to the Arab Spring, I don't see that as a condemnation of leaderless digital revolutions. I do think people jump the gun a lot, but I think if anything it presages a problem that we've had later on, in that these echo chambers, these bubbles exist. Now, in our society, these bubbles are more voluntary. We choose what we take in, we choose what we engage with, and we tend to choose, for whatever reason, to engage with and to spread content that we already agree with, to interact and befriend people who we broadly agree with. And that means it can be shocking when something from outside that bubble occurs or impinges on us. But that's voluntary with us. It's something we do to ourselves. Whereas if we look to the Arab Spring, I mean, our interactions online with the Arab Spring were with a relatively small group of tech-savvy, affluent, more Western-influenced people. And it created this false impression in us and amongst them of this kind of progressive wave in these countries. There certainly was dissatisfaction with the governments that they had, the dictatorial governments and so on. But while they may have contributed and helped to bringing down those governments, what has come in has often turned out to be worse, because these more westernized, more liberal, more tech-savvy, more engaged people weren't representative of the population as a whole any more than liberal elites in America were representative of America as a whole. And that's why Trump was such a shock to people. I think none of us are really experiencing the world as it is, even when we make an effort to, because even when you make an effort to do that, you'll still find yourself being blocked and cut off from people who disagree with you, because they don't want your views to impinge on them, and their choices impact on whether their views reach you. And the Arab Spring, the issue, the disconnect between our impression of the Arab Spring and what the Arab Spring actually was, is one that was exacerbated by this techno gap, I guess, affluence gap. That's disappearing slowly as mobile phones with internet access and so on become more common, as Africa and China and the Middle East develop more generally for their populations. Though whether that continues remains to be seen. But just a few years back, that wasn't the case. So things are shifting, but I think that's a reason we can look to for the Arab Spring kerfuffle, in that it gave the wrong impression. So why has BLM worked, and why has Gamergate worked as leaderless digital revolutions? I think the difference there is that they've managed to stay focused on a unifying goal. Gamergate more than BLM. but both have suffered splits and disagreements and so on, and both have attracted unsavory elements. So you'll find black supremacists and your actual garden variety racist very much tied up into Black Lives Matter, through involvement of people from breakaway groups or directly with the Nation of Islam and so on, with their ideas of black supremacy. But what's strange is that nobody really takes those extreme elements as being representative of Black Lives Matter as a whole, whereas in something like Gamergate, they do take trolls and so on who aren't even part of Gamergate as being representative of the whole. This is probably something to do with protected status, victim narratives, all the rest of it. It's not acceptable to broad brush a race-oriented group in the way it is acceptable to broad brush a group that isn't on that basis. Throughout this chapter, there are some severe and repeated problems with Nagle's analysis, and she seems to have skipped the step where she shows that these assumptions have any kind of backing. She doesn't really support any of these assumptions that she makes, and that severely affects the analysis throughout this chapter. For a start, she assumes that the online counterculture, such as it is inherently and necessarily right-wing. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that the right wing learned from online meme culture and the chans and so on, and it did so by kind of lampreying onto it and making that step to modernize and learn the tactics and so on. And it did agree with that group on some things for a time, but that doesn't mean that the online counterculture is right wing. It's not. These terms has just screwed up to the point of being nearly useless at this point. I mean, a lot of online memesters are essentially apolitical until you fuck with something that they love. They're iconoclastic, they're cynical. Many of them are, like me, disenchanted leftists. But a lot of them are just not political. They only care about something once it affects them. To assume that they're part of the right or part of the left is just insane, and I don't think it can be backed up by evidence, really. I mean, they're happy to mock anyone. Look at what Jeb Bush came in for example. Milo's gotten hit as much as he's been elevated. It's they're equal opportunity cunts, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I mean, alt-right has become a slur as much of anything. What it used to mean, what it's come to mean, has caused a split amongst that. People have been lumped in with it. Much of the actual kind of newly reinvigorated right is very much against many of the things that online culture embraces. I mean, the online culture embraces porn, things that much of the reinvigorated right considers to be degeneracy. A lot of these online shit posters love traps, meaning trans people. They really care very little overall for any particular ideology or politics, and they often fetishize non-European culture, particularly Japan and so on. So where does that fit into the white nationalist narrative? It doesn't really, except that white nationalists sometimes hold up Japan as an example of a essential ethno-state. But none of this really works together. I mean, the term conservative, that really applies to conservatives who had bowed to the neoliberal teat, the consensus politics in the sort of centre-right. The alt-right in some ways was more kind of traditional conservatives who didn't want to move that far, and in other ways was a new, more youthful libertarian right. I'm going to get in trouble with some of the people who watch what I do who are white nationalists for talking about the alt-right in that way. And yes, Spencer claims to have coined the term. So I want to be clear that when I'm talking about the alt-right, I've watched it go from white nationalism to kind of alternative conservatism, and then back to white nationalism. And the irony of that is that return to meaning white nationalism came much more by virtue of the mainstream kind of more left-wing media painting it as neo-Nazism, to the point where the people who'd just taken it to mean alternative conservatism had to drop it. So it's weird in that, you know, Richard Spencer and the genuine far right have been aided by the mainstream media in returning the meaning of the alt-right to a more extreme right-wing viewpoint than it was for some time. I just find that rather ironic. I think the better term for this kind of conglomeration across the political lines is cultural libertarian, a term, as far as I can make out, coined by Alan Bakari, who is one of Breitbart's kind of token liberals, really. And you know, in that, he's talking about people who just basically want to be left the fuck alone when it comes to social issues, and that's something that cuts across the political spectrum, the conventional political spectrum, left to right, and very much emphasizes that authoritarian versus libertarian split that I've been talking about, and which I think characterizes the new politics. When Nagle talks about the kind of radical libertarian technologist side, that's when I think she gets it mostly right in this chapter, though calling it right wing doesn't fit in a traditional sense, and this again is this consistent problem of labeling everything right wing. I mean, they have their issues, obsessed with bitcoins, or Dunning-Krugerrands as I prefer to call them, crazy ideas like seasteading, etc., which would be a good idea. But these are liberal as well as libertarian ideals. They're alternative ways of escaping hierarchy and maximizing freedom, albeit limited to a very few people. She talks about the mask in V for Vendetta, which is a reference to classical left anarchism, and the character in that book fights an oppressive far-right government. It's, again, insane, frankly, to think that this symbol is somehow a right-wing symbol rather than an anti-authoritarian one, a rebellious one against control. I think part of the problem that she's having is part of the problem that the kind of classical left-wing establishment, not classical liberals, but the left-wing establishment as we've come to think of it, I think it's a problem that they have, in that they don't seem to comprehend or understand that they are the establishment. A lot of them seem locked in this kind of 60s mindset that they're still fighting the man, even though they are now the man. You know, they are the ones now imposing. I really think you need to understand this shift to libertarianism versus authoritarianism, and all these disparate groups, that their unifying factor is their libertarian side, whether it's cultural, economic, or whatever. But it's mostly this cultural libertarianism that brings them all together. And these leaderless movements work best when they're like Gamergate, when it's an emergent system, like a flock of birds, like a murmuration of starlings. You know, it just comes together organically, and whatever gets the attention of the flock, that's what they move to. You know, without leaders, without people attempting to really impose control. I mean, temporarily a leader might pop up and people will listen to them, and that draws the flock in a particular direction. But there's usually a lot of churn, and there's an advantage to not having leaders that can be brought down in that way. She thinks that the online misogyny is genuine rather than just trolling or ironic. She thinks that /poll is sincere when a lot of it isn't, and doesn't really seem to understand how Chan culture works, that it's this kind of unfiltered, raw id and a brutally Darwinistic marketplace of ideas, which is, I think, why 4chan is, or at least was, such a powerful presence online, despite being limited to this one hard-to-use forum. Because it was so competitive and overwhelming, and because it was reduced to ideas, that's why memes that succeeded there were so powerful moving outside, why operations originating there had such impact. She does at least acknowledge that the Chans can do as much good as they do evil or neutral prankstering. I mean, they're just made up of people, and whatever they do is whatever gets the attention of the flock. Whether that's outing a paedophile, tracking down someone who was cruel to an animal, flooding an old lonely guy with presents and strippers and whatever else. It's just whatever takes their fancy. They're merry pranksters. Repent, Harlequin, said the TikTok man. They're Harlequins. They're jamming their foot in the gears and just doing what feels right. That's how it works. Trying to say kek, for example, as she does, it's somehow a symbol of right-wing beliefs. It's just stupid. Again, it's just another way of saying lol. The right wing has temporarily shared certain goals with this cynical libertarian monad that is 4chan, and it certainly learned from it. But it remains a mistake, I think, and a fundamental mistake, to conflate the resurgent right with this online Chan culture. She does manage to correctly identify the one thing that is absolutely guaranteed to get the cruel attention of the online flock: fucking with it. Political correctness exists to interfere with and censor people's expression, especially their edgy expression. Feminism has become an authoritarian and censorious force. Racial sensitivities are meaningless when everyone's anonymous. On the Chans, on the internet more broadly, often you're judged genuinely by your character and your ideas, not your skin, not your identity. It's important to note, I think, that it's not being a woman that gets you targeted by these people. It's what you do. Being a woman might alter the kind of harassment that you get, but you still get less harassment than men, and it's of a different kind than men get. And the problem there is identity, again. With your identity revealed where it should be meaningless, you are often exposing what it is that your buttons are to be pushed. If you're a feminist, it's obvious that being told to go to the kitchen and make someone a sandwich, or rape threats or whatever else is going to trigger you. That might sound like victim blaming, but it's not really. It's like the glowing vulnerable spot on some kind of boss in a computer game. Shoot here. It's people will react to that. Not all of them for the best reasons by any means, but it's what you do that draws people's ire. It's not who you are. And this includes reacting in a naive way to meaningless online threats. Pretending that trolling and online abuse is a female-only issue is thoroughly disingenuous, and draws the ire not only of trolls but of victims who don't fit that protected class. Yeah. And she goes on, and I think it'll happen more in a later chapter, to conflate the various strands of the manosphere to try and support this idea that the online misogyny is somehow genuine. While I'm sure that there are some genuine shitheads out there who hold genuinely regressive views about women, to conflate that whole thing together and then to use that to further conflate other online groups into the same batch, to take trolls seriously and so on. These are fundamental things that someone who claims to research this kind of stuff should know, and she hasn't. And furthermore, even if you do lump all these groups together, that's not what the alt-right is. That is its own beast. It's inevitable that she would get into Gamergate, and this is the point where if it had been a physical book, I would have thrown it across the room. But tablets are relatively expensive, so I wasn't going to do that. The first passage is kind of hopeful. It looks like maybe she's going to give a more balanced discussion about Gamergate. She's not going to please either side or whatever. But mostly it's the same false narrative that anyone who is involved with Gamergate is intimately familiar with. There's little comfort here for people who were actually involved and who knew what it was about. It's almost entirely the false narrative that we've come to expect. And again, this speaks to a lack of effort and a lack of understanding on the part of the author, and that's disappointing and terrible, especially in someone who's supposed to be, a PhD and is supposed to be a specialist in online anti-feminism. But I think that's where the problem comes. She's not a specialist in online anti-feminism. I think she's a specialist in feminism and has come at it from looking at it that way, treating them not as critics but as abusers or regressives, not as genuinely liberal people who have misgivings about the authoritarian, censorious, sex-negative stance that modern feminism has taken, but instead just paints them as misogynists. So at least she tries to give it some context by talking about Sarkeesian, but she frames it in the way that supposedly Sarkeesian was the victim of a hate campaign. There's this conflation again of trolls and criticism, dishonestly put together, as we've seen more recently with the fuss around VidCon, with people being called harassers and abusers who are her critics. She never responds to critics, of course, which is why people get increasingly frustrated, and when her arguments never change. I mean, there's the Jefferson quote, ridicule is the only weapon that can be employed against unintelligible propositions. And if someone never bothers to explain their propositions or defend their propositions, ridicule, mockery, these are all fine, but they're not harassment. Sitting in an audience is not harassment. Criticizing her work is not harassment. It shouldn't be baffling that this kind of reaction exists if you understand it in context. If you understand Jack Thompson, if you understand Pat Pulling, if you understand the PMRC, if you understand Frederick Wortham, if you understand Elvis only being allowed to be shot from the waist up, if you understand the fuss over penny dreadfuls in the Victorian era, or chapbooks going back to the 1600s, for God's sake. The shock that the printing press was to a lot of people. If you understand the continuum, particularly the modern continuum since Wortham, of moral panics and pushbacks, it should not be at all baffling why people were upset at her. Her offence was calling for censorship. She's not a critic. She's not saying, I don't like these things, here's why. She's saying these things are bad, wrong, terrible, horrible, perpetuate nastiness in the world, and spoken or unspoken, and she's done both. The implication is that they should be censored and controlled and gotten rid of. It's obvious why people reacted badly to her, and whether it's trolls attacking her because she's paraded her weakness in front of the public, or whether it's critics, it's important that you not confuse the two. And if you're writing this book and you're supposed to be an expert on the internet, you should be able to separate those two things. And yet Nagle seems incapable of doing so. This is disingenuous, utterly disingenuous. And Sarkeesian doesn't debate, she doesn't enter into discourse, she doesn't talk to anybody, she won't even tolerate questions, again, as we can see from VidCon. So what choice do people have? Is it any surprise that she's been a target of trolling and criticism, and can't some blame be laid at her door for the way that she reacts? I mean, take as a key example of double standards, the face punch game made by Bendelin Spur, which was a focus of a lot of the kind of early fuss about the harassment Sarkeesian's taken. Well, there were face punch games and worse for Jack Thompson, yet nobody seemed to think that that was a problem. There have been face punch and other games involving Donald Trump. No one really seems to have picked up on that and considered it to be a problem. Yet there's this person, this critic, the new Jack Thompson in a lot of ways, getting exactly the same treatment without gender bias as Jack Thompson got, and somehow this is the end of the world. Now, to me, that suggests a degree of benevolent sexism and privilege from which Anita is gaining, and from which someone like Jack Thompson wasn't. The double standard is clear, and surely for a feminist, she should want to be treated the same as everyone else. Whether that means she needs to man up or Jack Thompson needs to girl down, well, yeah, that depends on your point of view. Her Kickstarter, made more money than its target, but it also never ever met its goals. And the degree of the ire that was directed towards her came from people who had backed her and felt they were being exploited or ripped off. You know, so already, even before we've even got into Gamergate, even before we've even got into Zoe Quinn, the whole narrative about Sarkeesian is just wrong in this book. And again, it's just, where is the research? Where is the indication that this person has a PhD? How can they be so utterly wrong? And how can they claim to present such a one-sided point of view and yet at the same time claim they're not going to please anybody? When it comes to Quinn, the focus, she does criticise the game that Quinn made, that was rubbish and so on, but poo-poos pre-existing issues around, say, Wizard Chan or Game Jams, doesn't really mention the Fine Young Capitalists and Zoe Quinn's sabotage of them. You know, just kind of poo-poos it all. It was about ethics. The targets did just happen to be social justice warriors, feminists, women, but, you know, they were the people being shit. Should they get a pass just because they have a vagina or an unconventional sexuality or whatever? That doesn't sound like equality to me, but none of this is explored in this chapter. There's a cheap attack kind of dismissing whether people should be this upset or this interested or this focused on games. And she does, and this is one point where she does criticize both sides. But let's consider, this is $100 billion industry that makes art. To dismiss it as mere toys that people shouldn't be bothered with, it is an approach that you would never see applied to literature or film or painting or whatever. You know, oh, so what? Someone cut the Mona Lisa up. It's just painting, kid stuff, finger paints. You would never see that same kind of attitude. It's kind of weird, especially in someone who's supposed to be immersed in online culture. It's weird to see them be that kind of dismissive. So in the context that this is a big industry and an artistic industry with a tradition of defending its own free expression and fighting back against regulation and so on, I don't think it can be called an overreaction for people to react in this way, especially when you place it in that historical context that I've talked about. She also seems to confuse and conflate Quinn with other issues, confuses it all in with Brianna Wu, Felicia Day, etc., who tried to self-insert themselves into the whole thing. She talks about the IRC channel, the Five Guys thing. That predates Gamergate. There was no conspiracy there. It was shitposting and mockery. I was actually in it. So there was no conspiracy against Quinn to ruin her career or whatever. But interestingly, there was collusion and conspiracy between journalists, something that's not mentioned here, through the Game Journo Pros list. And as we've discovered recently, Quinn has genuinely been involved in blacklisting and trying to ruin the careers of game developers. So this whole section of this chapter on Gamergate is just terrible. There's more shoddy research and more kind of bringing groups together that shouldn't be confused and conflated. I mean, she takes Encyclopedia Dramatica seriously when you really shouldn't. I mean, Encyclopedia Dramatica is really just calcified shitposting. It's the Chans if it's stuck around, I guess. While there's often useful information on there, taking it seriously is just kind of absurd. In many ways, I think it's kind of a troll on Wikipedia in that way. You know, anyone can write any old shit on Encyclopedia Dramatica in the same way anyone can write any old shit on Wikipedia. And I think there's some kind of undercutting satirical suggestion there that you shouldn't take wiki seriously, but yeah, that's by the by. She continues as the chapter draws to a close to conflate Chan culture with the right, which it isn't, and Gamergate with the right. I mean, but we know from Brad Glasgow's research, from my research, from self-selected research, from research of other observers, that Gamergate was very much libertarian left, the bottom left quadrant of the political compass, overwhelmingly so. You look at individual political attitudes, and they're almost all fairly well aligned with the left, with a couple of exceptions that suggest that it's more libertarian than authoritarian. But then, this is as we'd expect. But to claim that it's right wing in the teeth of all that evidence is just insane, and again shows a distinct lack of effort on research, a lack of understanding of what she's dealing with. And then just as you're about ready to give up on her analysis, she does correctly identify that this was like an initial skirmish in the current culture war, that this was a culture war shove. The gamers drew a line in the sand. No, we're not going to succumb to your censorship and so on. And they successfully managed to fight off most of this current kind of push into their territory. They lost some ground, but overall I think they were successful. I don't think she understands that Gamergate and similar groups are the inheritors of the cyber utopianism to be found in Perry Barlow's manifesto. It's the rest of the left that has shifted, has become censorious and authoritarian and much more, what would be the right word? Dogmatic, I suppose. Much more extreme, much more authoritarian. Whereas groups like the Chans, groups like Gamergate and so on, still very much adhere to that older, more libertarian view of the internet as an informational utopia, for all they might dress it up in cynicism and so on. You know, yeah, killers have posted things on 4chan, but why does that mean anything? We've seen live streamed murders on Facebook, and yet you wouldn't say the same things about Facebook as you would about 4chan. You know, they're both popular places on the internet. It's not surprising that narcissists and psychopaths wanting recognition would go to either one to express their desire to be known. It doesn't say anything about the platform any more than writing a psychotic manifesto on Basildon Bond paper reflects on the company that makes that paper. You know, this chapter really makes me think that this whole book is going to be massively poorly researched, incredibly biased, and despite these occasional hits of accuracy, you know, those hits appear to be more by luck than judgment, but we'll see if she can recover as the book goes on.